Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. This is a very special episode of The Sins of Silicon Valley. I almost didn't even make this, but my experience in this situation is so surreal that I couldn't not share it. So to provide a couple of pieces of background, right? The first one is sometimes famous events or news affects us more than we would expect, right? We know a guy who knew the guy that was on that national news thing, right? In this case, this reminds me of an earlier podcast episode I did called The Nazi in My Backyard, where the police arrested a guy who showed up in the national news that had this crazy Looney Tunes van of all these, anti-CNN posters stuck on the outside of his van, and how he was basically planning on taking a machine gun and killing a lot of the Orthodox Jewish community that lived in Aventura back when we used to live there. And this is kind of bizarrely close to home in the sense that, I'm not directly related to any of it, but as I've said before on the podcast, in particular in this series, I had my ability to advertise on Facebook removed back in December when I shared a news article on Governor DeSantis sending armed state troopers into the home of former state employee Rebecca Jones, and how they pointed guns at her kids, and how it was basically retaliation for the fact that she posted a COVID dashboard that disagreed with the official state numbers, right? And you can't make this stuff up, right? Facebook, which had previously let me share links and post all kinds of things, including asking for a new constitution, or, the Irredeemable Party, which is probably the harshest episode I've ever done against conservatives, right? If there's anything that's going to get me canceled if somehow I become famous, it's that episode. And Facebook and Google both allowed these things with no problem. But lo and behold, you try and share a news article about DeSantis and his treatment of a former state employee, and Facebook can't have that. And by the way, my advertising lock is still removed, right? So this was a permanent ban. And, I can't talk about these things outside of context of both everything I've said in Facebook and the 3 episodes I've done on Facebook, or the fact that Twitter exists, in my opinion, to promote Bitcoin. So with all that background, let me summarize what this bizarre experience is. And I basically, when I reestablished my Twitter account, largely because I was just so disgusted with Facebook that I just left, I subscribe to a number of Twitter accounts, including Rebecca Jones, who goes by @GeoRebecca. And at one point, she's complaining about this crazy person who is stalking her. And I'm like, well, that's creepy, so I'll block this person, because she's requesting other people to block it. But, there's a couple of people in the comments that say that, they tried to block Max Nordau in the past, and when they do, miraculously, they're unblocked. So I'm like, yeah, I've run into that a couple times, so I'm going to start tracking this, right? Screenshots of your friend, keep the receipts. And I contact Twitter support, and I tell them, I'm tracking this, and lo and behold, the very next day, Max Nordau was unblocked. And at the time, Rebecca Jones had taken out a restraining order on the now current media consultant for Governor DeSantis in his future presidential campaign, and we'll get to that in a second. But I'm like, wow, this is kind of crazy town, right? I mean, I've run into crazy things with Facebook and Twitter censors in the past. and been actually stalked by support employees in the past, but nothing like this. And so I have a thread with a screenshot in it, actually took 3 physical snail mail letters, printed them out, got them notarized as an affidavit, sent one to the Department of Homeland Security, one to Twitter Legal, and one to the Virginia State Police, which is where Rebecca Jones now lives. Now, again, full disclosure, later on in this bizarre saga, Rebecca Jones, or at least her account, blocked me. And to be totally honest, I nearly just dropped all of this because, I don't want a white knight and I don't want to be stalker like the crazy Max Nordau person. But at the end of the day, I realized that if Twitter is unblocking me, for all I know, Twitter blocked me from Gia Rebecca. I have no idea. At the end of the day, I don't care. I'm doing this podcast because this entire bizarre circumstance, to me, boils down in a tangible form just how stupid and crazy the social media companies and the tech companies are. And on the YouTube version of this podcast, I'm saving the receipts, which is to say that I started initially taking screenshots before and after, blocked, unblocked, on a daily basis. And, I one-upped it by going to the Play Store and looking for a recording app. And because I don't trust the Twitter app, because in the past my phone literally had to do a factory reboot because I was hacked by Twitter, and I'm not going to get into that. Suffice to say that I personally believe, based on the settings I had on my phone, that my phone was hacked through the Twitter app. And as such, I don't have the Twitter app on my phone. I access it by the web only. And at the end of the day, you can make of that what you want, but I did a factory reboot on my phone a while ago because of some stuff that has happened with my experience with Twitter and some stuff that's happened in my experience with Facebook. And the essence of that is, in my opinion, the claims by the right and conservative media that social media is biased against conservatives is balderdash, right? You look at who they have on their media, who invests in these companies, all the supposed efforts they make to stop Russian bots is just balderdash, right? So anyway, my investigation into who is this Max Nordau person, because if I'm trying to block a person and Twitter is going to all the trouble of literally every single day unblocking who they are, I wanted to know a bit more about them. And I do want to clarify for those who might just be listening to it and who have the opportunity to go and look at the YouTube video. My original intent was to start recording this every single day, just as a nice visual way of showing how this was happening every single day, right? So I was going to, on April 15th, record block, and then go on the 16th and see it unblocked, and then block again, and then set up an entire video presentation of this. And lo and behold, what actually happened in the process of doing this is it changed literally right before my eyes. So what you're going to see in the video is a loop of them literally changing it right in front of me. Now, there was another instance where it was actually blocked when I got on. And I was so happy about this that I went to the thread where I was tracking all this, and I tagged Twitter support. And then all of a sudden, it's unblocked, right? So, in other words, another set of videos I have and a couple of threads that I've since unpinned, because what's the point? Because that's, at the end of the day, nobody cares, right? Nobody cares that this crazy social media company has a Twitter employee who goes out of their way to unblock Max Nordau, who is the media director for Ron DeSantis, who is the very likely vice presidential candidate for Trump in 2024, right? So, I mean, that doesn't make me famous. It doesn't make me a good or a bad person. But here I have carte blanche video proof that Twitter is fucking with me, and nobody cares, right? There's no social media regulatory police. there, I have filed a complaint with the Better Business Bureau and the FTC, and they've done jack and shit. And so even with literal video evidence of Twitter's malfeasance and collusion with enemies of the state, they get away with it, right? So the reason I'm doing this episode is because these companies are out of control. In fact, DeSantis has passed a law that all of the liberal media is making fun of because they say it violates the First Amendment. No, it doesn't. I want to be very specific, folks. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging free speech or the press or the freedom of assembly, which that it definitely does. It does give people the ability, or at least that or another legislation, they've been talking about literally letting them run over people with their cars if they, quote, believe that they're threatened and trying to get away, right? It's crazy and creepy, all the things that he's doing. But among the things that this law does is it actually requires social media companies to document their disciplinary actions and disclose them. So that if, for example, they're in conservative tiny minds, they're biased against conservatives, then they have to show it. Like, who are they blocking? Who are they shadow banning? And why? And I do guarantee you that the day that this law becomes active, and I'm still trying to find out when it goes active because it sure looks like it's going to be signed, the day this goes active, I will be filing charges or disclosure of everything that Facebook is doing. I mean, everything that Twitter is doing. Now, do I expect the state to actually do anything? No, I do not. I don't expect anything to come from this because what this really is about is helping Trump. Let's be honest here, folks. But if I can screw with Twitter after they've been screwing with me for years, I'm definitely all in favor of it. And as far as I'm concerned, all of the people that say that it's against the First Amendment to prevent a private media company from deplatforming a candidate, and I want to ask this, right? If the state of California, if the state of California passed a law saying that they couldn't do it to Biden, would you object to that? Because in my opinion, if in the 2024 election, Facebook and Twitter deplatform Biden, especially if he hasn't actually done anything, the left would be injustifiable up in arms about these companies. And frankly, they should already be up in arms, and many already are, but not enough people. Not enough people are upset about the things that social media does. And so anyway, let's get back to Max Nordau. So Max Nordau is a nom de guerre based on a late 19th century founder of Zionist philosophy. I'm not trying to use that as a pejorative. That's actually how he described himself. And was one of the modern founders of the Zionism movement that later in the 1940s related to the nation of Israel, right? So the person who is taking this name is clearly, I guess, either very pro-Israel or Jewish. Didn't find that out. What I do find fascinating is that the National Review, which has recently done a series of quote, exposés, end quote, on Rebecca Jones and how horrible she is and how much of a, quote, fraud, end quote, she is, largely based on the work of Max Nordau, also went out of their way to quote the hashtag BlueAnon. So if you've ever dealt with Q and MAGA on Twitter, you know that every time they want to denigrate supposed conspiracy theory, i.e. exposing what they're actually doing, or any connection between Trump and Russia, they'll put hashtag BlueAnon, right? And the person who basically invented this hashtag was Max Nordau. Now, if you look at Max Nordau's feed, it's gotten a little bit more diverse since then. But at the time, and you don't have to take my word for it, just look at the screenshots that I took. This person was utterly obsessed with Rebecca Jones, right? Rebecca Jones has about 400,000 followers, no blue dot. And it was patently obvious that DeSantis, who is a millionaire, had hired this person to dig up as much dirt as they could possibly find, real or fabricated, on Rebecca Jones, and spin it up into the dust storm that is the conservative echo chamber, right? That was obvious. And I and several other people were saying that it's obvious that this person is working for the eventually to be DeSantis presidential campaign. And I suspect that she was officially hired not because they care that other people were seeing what was patently obvious, but that in the DeSantis social media bill, she's going to get certain protections as being a media employee. And I guarantee you she's going to have a blue dot by the time the year is out, right? Whereas Rebecca Jones, who has desperately tried to get a blue dot, can't. Now, in the spirit of full disclosure, I have no idea whether Max Nordau's charges that she managed to get in the Wikipedia page about Rebecca Jones doing some crazy stuff in her previous two positions with ex-lovers. I don't know. I've had friends and family do some really crazy stuff when it comes to love, so I'm not going to judge. What I do know is that everything that I've seen so far on the fact that Rebecca Jones reported the real numbers and DeSantis tried to cover it up, everything I've seen the conservatives bring up is basically bullshit, right? And at the end of the day, let's think about who has more credibility. Republicans or anyone else, right? The only people who find Republicans having any credibility are Republicans. And the exception to that is a whole bunch in the latest trend of things where the Republicans basically got a lot of the both-sider centrists to pass this National Review article that supposedly exposed Rebecca Jones as much as they could, literally the day after Rebecca Jones condemned Israel and its attacks on Gaza. So you gotta wonder if somebody who's literally named one of their multiple accounts after the founder of Zionism has an axe to grind on somebody that is attacking Ron DeSantis and isn't a fan of Israel. Just throwing that out there. Either way, at the end of the day, the idea that I can't block this person is insane. Right? Try it for yourself. And if you actually are able to block, because I had a few other people try and block this person, and supposedly they're able to, although I doubt they check every day like I do. But if you think that's the case, try tagging Twitter support and saying you're watching them, and start a thread and watch, lo and behold, Twitter support will unblock Max Nordau. And it's crazy. I mean, it's not a bug, right? Whatever it is, it's not a bug, and I really don't think it's like some kind of legal requirement, because sometimes remember that Twitter has had to unblock people that by court order were blocked. That makes no sense because Rebecca Jones was only recently given actual journalistic credentials. I'm sorry, Max Nordau was only recently considered an actual official candidate for anything. Up until then, they literally described themselves as a freelance journalist. It's creepy and a little crazy, let me tell you. This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright 2021.
To fight the forces of evil!